Hello and welcome to Stronger Than Reason. So, I wanted to talk today about this thing that I have here. In the last episode, I talked about Public Image Limited and how they released an album in a metal film canister, and they called it Metal Box. Very creative. And I said that I didn't have a copy of that in the metal packaging, which was a bummer. However, I do have this metal box, which is similar, though of course it's square rather than round, and it's stamped with the words Black Box. And that's because it's a box set called Black Box WaxTrax Records the First 13 Years. And this came out in 1994, and I probably picked it up around 2000 or so. And of course I bought it used, so I'm probably missing some of the nifty feelies that were in here, but I do have this fold-out poster, which is pretty cool. Of course, there's a booklet in here. If I can actually get these out. There's a really long booklet here with the history of WaxTrax Records. All kind of cool stuff in here. Pictures of bands, letters from the various musicians. Pretty neat. It came with 3 compact discs. And these compact discs came in these completely black jewel boxes, which are pretty cool. So you can only distinguish them by the numbers that are on each of the discs in here, of course. So it also came with these nifty drink coasters themed with the Black Box logo. Here's the second compact disc, and we have a cool Black Box patch, and it does go like this. Yeah, I got it right on the third try. And here's disc 3, so it's a 3-disc set. There was a nice little couple of postcards in here, so you could mail away for more WaxTrax stuff. Pretty neat. They used to include that kind of stuff in a lot of their releases. And, of course, the so-called 69 feet of audio tape outtakes lifted directly from the studio floor, I'm sure. However, it's unfortunately not 2-inch studio audio tape, but ordinary cassette tape, which makes me think they probably just cannibalized all their unused stock and stuffed it in these boxes. But pretty cool. In theory, if you had a lot of patience, you could spool this onto a cassette, play it back on your vintage Sony Walkman, and hear some crazy stuff. It looks like I am missing some of the things that came in here. There was a fishnet-style bag that they put in here, and I didn't get that with my used copy, unfortunately. I think there was also a card that showed the number of the limited release, and I didn't get that, so I have no idea what number this is, because they did release this in the non-metal box format, much like PIL did with their release. And this metal box, I understand, was numbered. Gosh, maybe there's a number on the box somewhere. Wouldn't that be really cool if they'd stamped a number on it? But alas, I don't see anything. So, yeah, there might have been some other stuff too. I'm not sure. But they also released this as a VHS tape with some videos, and I don't have that. But of course, they're all on YouTube now, naturally, so you don't really need that. But this was an important thing for me back in the day because there wasn't much first-hand information about WaxTrax available in the late 90s, unless you did send away for their newsletter, which some of us did, and we had copies of those floating around. But we didn't really get the kind of information that they put into that booklet describing who was in the bands and, you know, how the bands came to be and some of the history and that kind of stuff. So this was really nice to have. And of course, this was in the days before Wikipedia. And at most, back then, you might have had some half-decent fan pages. You know, you remember when you would get a home page on the internet and you would put a bunch of animated GIFs out there and so on? Well, yeah. And you had fan-run FTP sites, of course. So does anyone else remember the great music FTP site that was at uwp.edu? That was the University of Wisconsin Parkside. And I think that's where my friends and I got our first Skinny Puppy sample list. So it was a big text file that identified the sources for all of the various samples on the first few Skinny Puppy albums. And we were pretty blown away that the internet provided such useful service to humankind by giving us the Skinny Puppy sample list. We were pretty blown away. And I know uwp.edu also had lyrics, they had discographies, and all kinds of nifty ephemera about the bands that we were very hungry for back in the early 90s. Yeah, so I kind of miss those days in a way. It's all just a little bit too easy now with discogs.org. But anyway, as it said in the title of this box set, the collection is a retrospective of the first 13 years of WaxTrax, and it includes their first single, which was Elephant's Graveyard by Strike Under, which had catalog number Wax001. And it also had a track by Divine, who amazingly and fabulously was on WaxTrax at one time. And, of course, tracks by others like Psychic TV, Fred Gianelli, TKK, Meat Beat, Manifesto, Coil, The Young Gods, The KLF, Greater Than One, Controlled Bleeding, etc., etc. But one prominent WaxTrax band that was not on here was Front 2 for 2, and they were prevented from appearing by the fact that they had signed to Epic Records at this point. However, KMFDM is on here because, as everyone knows, they won't sell to a major for a couple of bucks. No doubt about it, KMFDM sucks. So if you're ripping this collection for your own personal digital use, you'll be sure to want to add Headhunter and Welcome to Paradise, which of course are the only two Front 2 for 2 tracks that any 90s era DJ thought existed. So you can just forget their 6 other albums of amazing music. But needless to say, this is a pretty fun collection. And if you haven't seen it yet, I wholeheartedly recommend the more modern WaxTrax documentary, which Julia Nash herself put together. It's called Industrial Accident, The Story of WaxTrax Records, and it came out in 2018. I found it really entertaining and pretty illuminating, and it sort of made me wish I had been in Chicago in the 90s to participate in that scene. But as it turns out, I had been in Chicago in the 90s just once because I visited there in 1997. I was there for a week for work, and as I may have mentioned, I work in IT, and back in the day I had a job that sent me all over the country, and in retrospect, it was a pretty fun job. Too bad it went away. But I was in Chicago for some conference or other, staying in this dump that was right across the street from the renowned Drake Hotel, so not far from the John Hancock building. And I mention that because one night while I was there, I happened to catch the movie Hero, which starred Dustin Hoffman and Andy Garcia. And there's this climactic scene with the two of them sitting on a ledge in this hotel high above the city, and Dustin Hoffman is trying to talk Andy Garcia from out of jumping. And while I watched that scene, my eye kind of strayed off the TV to the building out the window, and it occurred to me that they were sitting on the ledge of the Drake Hotel, which was just across the street from me. And I could even see up there where they had been sitting, so that was pretty screwed up. Anyway, a few other strange things happened while I was on that trip. For one, I got the flu, and I ended up working very little. I basically got a vacation in Chicago, sitting in the hotel most of the time. And I think I mentioned that in the Tones on Tail episode because for whatever reason, I had their song Happiness stuck in my head like an earworm for the whole week. And I got to tell you, there's nothing like waking up at 2 a.m. to toss your cookies while humming Happiness. So I did feel well enough one day to venture out into the city, and I decided to take a chance and go visit the WaxTrax address that I saw on the back of all of my various records. It was, oh gosh, my eyes just aren't that good, folks. 1659 North Damon Avenue, Chicago, Illinois, 60647. And that was on all of my KMFDM CDs and all the other CDs I had from WaxTrax. So I figured there had to be something there, right? There had to be something at that address that was worth me being out of town, to take a trip out there and check it out. So if it wasn't the fabled WaxTrax store, it had to at least be an office or maybe a door with the WaxTrax name on it, something I could take a picture of. So I caught a cab, feeling adventurous, and I asked the driver to take me there. And it was funny because along the way, the guy picked my brain about getting into IT. I guess he was sick of driving a cab, and, who could blame him? So you know by now what happened, of course. You could see it coming from miles away. I get there, I pay the guy, he splits, and there's absolutely nothing. There's no store, there's no office. It's just a random corner in suburbia. And at this point, it started getting dark out. And fun fact, cabs are harder to find when you're way outside the city, or at least away from downtown. And this was 1997, so I don't even think I had a cell phone on me. Or if I did, it was a really primitive cell phone, and I probably had all sorts of roaming charges for being out of my service area. But of course, I ended up just sort of walking back toward the city in the dark. And after a period of time, I did flag down another cab, thankfully. And I was pretty weak from the flu after all, but damn, I was really disappointed. I guess a part of me was hoping that the record store would still be there and that Chris Connolly would be working the cash register, but no such luck. But if it isn't evident from this little story, I do love me some WaxTrax, and most of their hits are on this collection, minus Front 242 and minus any Ministry that Al released after moving to Sire Records. So basically, everything from Twitch and beyond is not on this collection. But there are even some Skinny Puppy related projects on here like Cyberactive and Download. And I could probably do a whole separate episode just about the Skinny Puppy side projects. But there are also a lot of Ministry side projects on here. And that's right, folks, as you no doubt have put together by now. We are about to tag up, so to speak, and talk more about Ministry, specifically the side projects that Al Jourgensen and Paul Barker co-produced in the late 80s and early 90s. And there were a lot of these. They were creating so much new music that they couldn't release it all as Ministry, so the solution was to create a handful of other projects, each with its own style, more or less, but with Al and Paul's unmistakable sound. And that was typically prominent drums, synths and guitars, and pretty witty samples. And as I mentioned in the RevCo episode, which was episode 18, which kind of dovetails with this one, those two adopted pseudonyms in their roles as producers. So Al was Hypo Luxa, and Paul was Hermes Pan. And the Black Box booklet says that those names were taken from a pair of, and I quote, fun-loving male Greek prostitutes, unquote. So take that as you may. So many an early industrial record featured the Luxapan production imprint, and they produced other people's music a lot of the time, but they also had a lot of these small side projects of their own, because industrial around this time, the late 80s, early 90s, was very hot in the United States, so WaxTrax were happy to release whatever Al and Paul came up with, knowing it would probably sell, at least in the United States. So as a youth, I recall scouring the CD singles bins in my local record stores for these little EPs that they'd come out with, and they weren't really advertised as being related to Ministry unless you kind of knew what you were looking for, or unless you saw that Luxapan imprint. Each of these would typically have from 2 to 5 tracks or thereabouts, with a few exceptions, as we'll see, and we'll kind of dig into each. So as I mentioned before many times, I read Al's book, and I read Chris Connolly's book, and if you're interested in this music, of course I recommend them both. I have to say that Al's was less than helpful in explaining how he made the sausage. His book is more about how many drugs he took and with which celebrities. But Chris's book was more insightful because he explained that all the songwriting really happened in the studio. They had just set up camp in one of the local studios like Chicago Tracks and just start whipping something up. So Jeff Ward or Bill Rieflin would record some drums, or they'd program some drums, and Paul would play some bass. Al would do some programming and play some guitar, and they'd get somebody to sing on it, and boom, they had a track. And it was only after they created the track that Al would decide which project it would be a part of. He'd say something like, well, this is definitely a Ministry song, or this would make a great Cox track, or let's make this its own thing. And sometimes the project would depend on who was involved, so certain guests might get their own band. For instance, Ian MacKaye fronted Pailhead, and Jello Biafra fronted Lard, and anything they touched went into those projects. And for others, the lines were a bit more blurred. Generally, you had the same set of supporting characters working on each project, so it was almost like a WaxTrax house band, sort of like the industrial equivalent of Booker T and the MGs. So I guess that would make Al the Steve the Colonel Cropper in this analogy. You know, the guy in the Blues Brothers who says, "Back at the Armada Room?" I'm just joking because Steve Cropper is, in fact, a super cool legend. But I digress. Now, of course, the Revolting Cocks were the most prominent of these projects, and I spoke a lot about them in that episode, so I won't rehash it all here. Go back and listen to episode 18 for my take on RevCo, which I really focus on their second album, Beer, Steers, and Queers, which is the greatest in my opinion. But let's just say that RevCo started off as a side project, but quickly became more of a sister band to Ministry. It was kind of like an alter ego. And as I said before, it was sort of the yang to Ministry's yin, or maybe that's vice versa. But Ministry was serious, and the Cocks were not. It was more than anything a way for the band to kind of let off steam. And when RevCo started, it was just Al with Richard 23, a front 2 for 2, and his pal Luke Van Acker. And it's funny, I read in the WaxTrax booklet, which I just reread last night, that Luke, his passport at the time, listed his occupation as megastar, which I just love that detail. But yeah, RevCo at that point was very much a Ministry and front 2 for 2 side project. But Richard left after the first album, and it more or less became like Ministry's kid brother or kid sister or possibly bastard stepchild. There were 3 RevCo studio albums in the late 80s, early 90s, and pretty much the same number of Ministry albums. So for a while, Al and Paul were dishing them out more or less 1-to-1. Also, RevCo was kind of special in that it was the only Ministry side project to headline actual tours. Now, as I said, it was commonplace for Ministry to play songs from all these different projects on tour, including RevCo. But oddly, as I've noted before, the reverse wasn't true. RevCo would never play Ministry or the other projects. I suppose it was because they were far too high and loaded to even attempt that. They could barely play their own music on the stage. But one of the earlier side projects, and definitely my favorite, was this thing they called PTP. Now, I read in Thrasher magazine back in the day that PTP was short for Programming the Psychodrill, which they said was a reference to a collage by J.G. Ballard. And I'm prepared to believe that, folks, because this is Thrasher magazine talking, and what other authorities did we honor in the early 90s? None. Okay, none. That was it. But this band, if you will, PTP, had a total output of just 3 tracks. The first was this song that Al did with Ogre in 1986 as a way to get Al's music into the movie RoboCop, and he couldn't do it as Ministry because of his contract, so he simply made up another band. And the way Al told the story, Ogre just happened to be in the studio that day, and Al asked who he was, and Ogre said, "Well, I'm a singer." So Al, being Al, told him to get behind the mic and make himself useful. So it was their first collaboration, but not their last, of course. And the result of that was a track called Show Me Your Spine. And you can hear it in the movie RoboCop, the first RoboCop, in the scene in the disco. And in the movie, it's all instrumental, though. You can't hear any of Ogre's vocals. And the whole thing, as I've mentioned before, is very, very 80s. So imagine the very loud Adrian Sherwood drums with lots of Fairlight orchestral hits. And I talked about that orchestral hit sample in the Art of Noise episode. But Al wouldn't release that track for many years until he made a collection of all of his side project work. And I think he finally put it out in the early 2000s on his Side Tracks compilation. But what he did release back in the day was this 2-track CD single, which is Rubber Glove Seduction backed with My Favorite Things. Now, Chris Connolly tells the story about these 2 songs in his book because Chris sang on both of them. Ogre wasn't involved in these at all. And Al and Paul did all the music. And evidently, they were getting funded by some mysterious benefactor who wanted to hear something that he described as zoo disco. And these two tracks came out of that arrangement. And Chris makes no bones that he loves the PTP tracks. And I have to agree, they're catchy, they're poppy, they're silly, but they're also pretty hard hitting. And we used to play these all the time in high school on mixtapes or whatever. So, again, I was an art nerd. I was in the art club, and we were involved in some pretty major extracurricular activities, like making these huge murals all around town. And I would regularly bring my vintage Toshiba boombox and just blast this crazy stuff. So somewhere out there is a long-suffering and now octogenarian art teacher who probably knows Rubber Glove Seduction by heart. So I'm sorry about that, Mrs. G, but this music would kind of blow some minds, though, regularly, mostly the kids who were into, top 40 stuff like Huey Lewis and the News. But of all of Al's side projects, I have to say that this one sounds the most like my own music that I make. Not that I'm trying to sound like PTP or like Al and Paul, but this is just very close to the style of music I most like to listen to. So that winds up being the sort of stuff I make. But that's PTP. I love it. The cover art is pretty funny with all these sort of modified packages. It reminds me of the cover to the Happy Mondays, Pills, Thrills, and Bellyaches, which had a very similar idea in the U.S. anyway. There's not much in the way of liner notes here, but what is here is actually pretty funny. They have this nice PTP logo, and it says PTP is Scorpio playing big bass drum and vocals, Alien Dog Star playing the pan flute and finger cymbals, and Frenchie L'Amour playing Spanish guitars. And there's a bunch of crazy stuff in here, but that's pretty much code for Chris Connolly, Al Jourgensen, and Paul Barker. So good stuff. I really dig this CD, even though it's incredibly short. I wish they had made an entire album or albums worth of this sort of silly music. Now you might think that PTP, with its astounding 3 tracks, would be the smallest of these side projects, but no. You would be wrong, because the smallest was this other thing that they called Acid Horse, and it had just a single track, albeit 2 mixes of a single track. And, of course, the name you got to just applaud, because it has 2 meanings, of course. It's a play on acid house, which was a very popular style of music around this time, the age of raves. And, of course, it's a play on the street names for LSD and heroin, so that's why it has such a trippy record cover here. But this was a collaboration with the guys in Cabaret Voltaire, who were in Chicago recording an album. And Cabaret Voltaire, of course, were a very influential English experimental band that dabbled in electronics and sound collage and later kind of industrial and dance music. And back in their early days, they would actually play gigs with Joy Division. So how's that for indie cred? It's pretty good. Al met those guys at a bar, I suppose, in Chicago when they were in town, and sort of as he did, invited them to come to the studio and throw down a track. And that track is called No Name, No Slogan, and it's just another favorite track of mine. It has these samples from Ennio Morricone's spaghetti western soundtracks, and it has this ridiculous vibra slap on it, which just gives it a very Wild West techno kind of feel. Chris Connolly sings on it. He kind of chants his way through the vocals. Al and Paul did this first track, which is kind of the main mix, and they did the second track with, I guess what happened was that Al and Paul did the first track with the Cabs in the studio, and it's just a complete banger. Later on, I guess Al gave the tracks to the Cabaret Voltaire guys, who at that time were Stephen Mallender and Richard H. Kirk. And later on, they kind of did their own mix, and they mailed it back to Al, and that was the second track. And I have to say that their mixes, I don't like it nearly as much, but yeah, their whole output as this band is just this single track, 2 versions of it. And once again, not much in the way of liner notes here. They also have some silly band credits here. They credit Acid Horse as Harold Sandoz, Alien Dog Star, who is almost certainly Al, Tennessee King, who is probably Chris, Biff, and Gallopin' Scorpio Saddlebutt, who I don't know. Maybe that was Chris. Chris always kind of throws a Scorpio in there. So that's it. That's Acid Horse. There's really not much else to the band. But again, I just love the sound they had on here and what they were doing with that. So next up, I'll just start leaving these up here. We'll build a nice mural. Next up is a little thing called 1000 Homo DJs. Now, first we have to address the band name. The story I heard was that Al was upset when he found out someone did an unauthorized mix of some Ministry song. And supposedly, the WaxTrax Presidente, Jim Nash, told him not to worry because no one would ever hear it except for 1000 Homo DJs. And this wasn't a slight against gays at all because, Jim was openly gay, as was his partner, the WaxTrax co-founder Danny Flesher, and it's just an example of Jim's humor. He's a very irreverent guy. So there are 4 songs on this disc. 2 of them came first as a 12-inch. So Apathy and Better Ways were the first 2 tracks for 1000 Homo DJs. And Al said that they were outtakes from the sessions that produced Ministry's The Land of Rape and Honey album. They're kind of like a noisy industrial rock. And this other track, Hey Asshole, which is sort of a novelty track, and I understand that it's really a chance for Jeff Ward, who is the drummer, to do his cop impersonation, and it's pretty funny, it's pretty strange. But the crown jewel of this project for sure is the final track, which is a cover of Black Sabbath's Supernaut, and Ministry still plays this live to this day. Great cover version. There was controversy over who was doing the vocals on this track, though, because originally Trent Reznor recorded them, and that version appears on the Black Box collection, and it is absolutely Trent. You can hear and recognize his voice very easily. But back in the day, Al couldn't release Trent's vocals because of the contract that Trent was in. So this disc contains the version with Al doing the vocals, and Al swears up and down that he re-recorded them. But even if he did such a good job emulating Trent that it sounds like he could have just distorted Trent's vocals beyond recognition. The world may never know for sure, but we have no reason to doubt what Al is saying. Regardless, it's a very fun track. It has an intro of a very paranoid Art Linkletter warning parents that all of their kids are trying to take LSD, which, I'm pretty sure they're not, so chill out, Art. But this cover art is awesome. It's a parody of the cover of Black Sabbath's Master of Reality. And again, the credits are pretty good. If we look in here, 1000 Homo DJs are Buck Satan, guitar, bass, and vocals. That's obviously Al. Officer Aggro, drums and vocals. That's clearly Jeff Ward. Ike Krull plays guitar. There's speculation that was probably Trent. And Wee Willie Reefer playing drums. That was clearly William Riflin. And Viva Nova doing female vocals. So there's a bunch of other silly insanity on here that you just gotta love. So yeah, 1000 Homo DJs, classic stuff. Next up, we're almost there, folks. The mighty. Oh, no, I'm not going to do that just yet. Next up, we have the mighty Lead into Gold. And this is essentially a Paul Barker solo effort, but with Al lending a hand here and there. And unlike the other things I've talked about so far, Lead into Gold released several albums and singles and EPs, and in fact is still doing that today. They just released an album a couple months ago. And I caught them live on tour a couple months ago, opening for Skinny Puppy, and they were great, as I described in the last episode. Back in the day, we mostly knew them for their single Faster Than Light, which is maybe their most pop-oriented song. It had a video that got played on 120 minutes from time to time, and famously, it had Trent Reznor in it, even though he didn't appear on the record. And it's funny how everyone focuses on that bit of trivia. Even the Lead into Gold Wikipedia page mentions it. I think it pissed Paul off, and I might have been in Jason Pettigrew's RevCo tour diary in Alternative Press. I talked about the tour diary in the RevCo episode, and you can still read it online. In there, Jason talks about how an interviewer wanted to talk to Paul about this point, and Paul got angry and pointed out that Bill Riflin was also in the video but not on the record. And I mean, his frustration was understandable. Trent's star pretty much eclipsed everyone else, despite the fact that Al and Paul were Trent's mentors. And I'm sure that Paul just got sick of the media fanboydom. Anyway, Paul really loves heavy, dark, sludgy music, and that's generally what this project is. It has lots of huge drums and arpeggiated synth with slow tempos. Paul does all the vocals himself, and he has a really unique voice. He's more than capable of fronting this band. And the first thing of theirs I got was this EP called Chicks and Speed Futurism, and I've always kind of wondered if KMFDM's More and Faster was a response to this title. But anyway, it's a handful of tracks. It does include Faster Than Light as the first track. Pretty neat release. There's Paul on the inner sleeve. And I also picked up their first full length called Age of Reason. And strangely, I don't have the jewel case, just this CD and the booklet. And let me pull this out. It also has Faster Than Light on it, plus a handful of other tracks. So Faster Than Light was clearly the big hit single. There's the cover art. And I like putting these old Lead into Gold records on when I'm in a certain kind of mood, you know, sort of craving that old meat and potatoes industrial sound. You know, no vegetables, just the meat and potatoes. This isn't really very uplifting music. It's not really industrial rock or industrial dance. It's sort of electronic sludge rock. So it's reminiscent of where Ministry went later with, you know, like the Filth Pig album. Slower tempos, heavier sounds for sure. Of course, Paul restarted Lead into Gold in 2015 when he put out an EP on Bandcamp. It was a new old stock recording that he called Low and Slow, and it was recorded around 1990, but was never released for whatever reason. And then he reformed the band as a live act fairly recently, playing Cold Waves and other shows. And then he came out with a brand new album in 2018 called The Sun Behind the Sun, which is fantastic. Of course, I bought that on Bandcamp, and I only have it digitally, so no CD to show you. But this year he came out with yet another album called The Eternal Present. All of this is great stuff. I encourage you to check it out. And I want to be clear, though, that Lead into Gold is not like a nostalgia act. They aren't aping Ministry. They're not Ministry light, and they're not trying to sound like the Land of Rape and Honey or anything. It's really its own thing. And Paul has a ton of artistic integrity. He's making the music he loves, regardless of whether anyone else likes it, and you got to respect that. Finally, we get to Pailhead. And so Al was always on the lookout for potential collaborators, and the story goes that he was in London just before recording what would become The Land of Rape and Honey, and he ran into Ian MacKaye. And now, for those who don't know Ian, he is a punk legend. For one thing, he fronted two seminal hardcore punk bands, Minor Threat and Fugazi, and you don't have to know much about hardcore to be familiar with those band names. If you're of a certain age, you've probably seen them on the back of more than a few jeans jackets in your lifetime. And you might also know Ian through stories about him told by one of his best friends, Henry Rollins. And if you haven't heard it yet, I encourage you to check out the Henry and Heidi podcast, specifically the episodes about the ice cream store and the pet shop, because Henry tells some hilarious stories that really explain the kind of guy Ian was when he was young. It's just really great stuff. Check it out. But of course, Ian also founded Discord Records and started the whole straight edge movement. Now, straight edge rejected booze, tobacco, and sex, and back in the day, you'd see young punks with the X on the back of their hands, and that meant straight edge. So it was pretty ironic for Ian to team up with Al, who was as opposite of straight edge as one could get, to the point where you would almost expect the two of them to annihilate each other like matter and antimatter. But I guess they bonded politically and artistically long enough for Ian to record some lyrics on these songs. So Pailhead as a project has 6 songs. All of them were pretty original in that they were blending industrial rock with hardcore punk. I mean, who else was even thinking to do this at that time? One of them was called I Will Refuse, which came out on a 12-inch backed with no bunny. And it started life as this instrumental that Chris Connolly originally sang on, as Chris described in his book. It was the first thing Chris ever did with Al. Chris's version is on his initial CC collection, and it's called Stick. And in his book, he says it was an honor being erased by Ian. It didn't bother him at all. Chris got along very well with Ian by all accounts. But I Will Refuse is probably my favorite of these songs, though they're all really good. It could have easily been a great Ministry song. So Pailhead was Al and Paul with Ian and Bill Riflin and Eric Spicer on drums, but they never played live with Ian. But Ministry did play some of these tunes live from time to time with Al on vocals, like Man Should Surrender. And they definitely were playing Man Should Surrender on the Mind Tour, as I recall. I think I have a few bootlegs of that. All right, finally, it's time to talk about Lard. And unfortunately, I don't own any Lard CDs. I never did own any Lard CDs. My knowledge of them comes solely from tapes I made from my friends back in the day. I haven't actually listened to them recently or at all for whatever reason. But what is Lard? Well, I'm glad you asked. It started off as Al and Paul with Jello Biafra and Jeff Ward. Jello, of course, is another punk legend, but whereas Ian MacKaye was East Coast in D.C., Jello was West Coast in San Francisco. So let's talk about Jello Biafra's resume. So, frontman for the Dead Kennedys, check. Friend of Frank Zappa, check. Founder of Alternative Tentacles Records, check. Defendant in a high-profile obscenity charge brought for Jello, including an H.R. Giger print and a Dead Kennedys album sleeve, check. Guy who helped popularize spoken word as a career, check. Candidate for mayor of San Francisco in 1979, receiving 3.79% of the vote and ultimately losing to Dianne Feinstein, check. By the way, his campaign slogan was, "There's always room for Jello." You just have to love that. So yeah, Jello Biafra is a legend. And Jeff, of course, was the live drummer for both Ministry and the Cox. And as we saw, occasional guest vocalist like he was on 1,000 Homo DJs. So as far as Lard is concerned, Jello is clearly in the spotlight. And I have to say up front that he is intelligent and articulate, not unlike Frank Zappa, maybe to a lesser degree. And that's no slight against Jello, because Frank Zappa was just on a completely different level than most of the rest of us mere mortals. But let's say Jello is someone who appreciates subversion. He's pretty critical of authority. And again, politically, he and Al saw eye to eye. And he has an absolutely unique voice. I think it's best described as a flamboyant gargle. But whatever band he's fronting, his lyrics are guaranteed to be politically cutting and funny and sometimes sardonic. And some of the songs fall into satire, where he's really taking the piss out of someone. He likes to make fun of American consumer culture and American politics. And under all of that, you have the patented Luxa pan industrial machine chugging away. So yeah, pretty good combo. Lard did a few EPs and a couple albums so far. The debut EP was called The Power of Lard, and it was followed by the first full-length, The Last Temptation of Reed. Reed being Reed Hyams, who was the owner of Chicago Tracks, as I recall. And then there was another LP called Pure Chewing Satisfaction, the cover of which showed a wonderful painting of a woman fondling a roll of toilet paper. So there was always a bit of absurdity with Lard, the kind that could make you laugh or the kind that could make you cry. Why did they choose Lard as a band name? In his podcast, which, again, I wholly recommend, Jello said he suggested it because you could put the word lard in all caps next to just about any photo, and it would change the photo's meaning entirely. So it was a powerful name in that way. And it spoke to Jello's need, I think, to point out American cultural excesses. I mean, we're talking about a guy named Jello here, folks. So Lard never did a proper tour of their own, but Jello would sometimes tour with Ministry, like you see on the In Case You Didn't Feel Like Showing Up video. So they'd play some Lard songs live with Jello from time to time. It's all good stuff. And I think Bill Rieflin and Ray Washam played drums in some of the later stuff, and Mike Scasia played some guitar. So what were some of the other so-called side projects of Ministry? Well, there was Welt, and this was a short-lived project between Al and Ogre. If I recall, it stood for When Everyone Learns Truth, but it never got off the ground. I think the deal they had was that Al would get a Welt tattoo and Ogre would get a RevCo tattoo. And I know Ogre got his because I saw it on his shoulder at a Skinny Puppy show. I have no tattoos, but if I did get one, I could hardly go wrong with a RevCo logo. Anyway, I guess they recorded one demo together that never really got released, and then they split up. And later, Ogre would resurrect the project with Mark Walk and would rename it Ogre, that's OHGR, and their first album would be called Welt, and they would go on to release many more albums, and they're still going today. So that was Welt. I can hear someone out there saying, "What about Pigface?" in their best, I don't know, annoying person voice. So I can hear someone else saying, "Al was never in Pigface, damn it," in their best comic book guy voice. So let's keep it polite, but that's correct. Al was never in Pigface, so it's not really a Ministry side project. It's certainly not a Luxa Pan project, even though Paul Barker was on the first album. Pigface came about as a reaction to the Ministry Mind Tour ending, and in a nutshell, some of the folks wanted the party to continue, and they wanted it so badly that they started another band, recorded an album of questionable merit, and went back on tour. And Al was not a part of any of that. So what about Buck Satan and the 666 Shooters and Surgical Meth Machine? Yeah, I'm not going to talk about these because they didn't happen in the 80s or 90s, did they? But technically, yeah, they're Ministry side projects, just nothing I've ever listened to or am even remotely interested in at all. I'm really only into the older stuff he did with Paul. But there is one other newer project I want to just say a word about, and that is something called Bells into Machines. Al was not involved with this either, but I think it was 2015 or so when I caught wind of it, probably on Slicing Up Eyeballs. Paul and Chris were getting together to do another project, and that got me excited. And for whatever reason, I guess because I had some artistic skill, as I set about making a cool logo for them. And I reached out to the band, and lo and behold, they dug it. And for a while, my logo was on their social media accounts and whatnot. Unfortunately, the band never really took off. They put out an album, but their plans to play festivals and so on never really came about, and there really wasn't much press, and the whole thing just kind of went away. But one fun thing that did come out of that interaction was that I got to exchange some emails with Chris Connolly, which was pretty cool. So that makes, 3 famous people I've ever spoken to on the internet. There's Chris Connolly, John Romero, and Neil Gaiman. I guess that means I'm pretty much famous too, right? Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, it was a really cool logo, I have to say, and I don't think it appeared on their final album, but maybe I should get that logo tattooed instead of the RevCo logo. Tough call. So why do I love these side projects? I love them for the same reason most people love music of their youth, because it reminds me of good times, but also because they represent a unique time in music history. I mean, industrial rock was new, and Al and Paul were fully exploring that whole space. They had so many ideas. They realized they could be a half a dozen different bands because they were at their peak creativity. And never again would they record so much. They would largely slow down after 1995 or so, and all of these side projects would kind of trail off. Al would take a very hard turn into speed metal, as we know, and he really would never look back. And that would leave a lot of his fans in the dust, me included, but would probably earn him new fans who weren't as interested in all this industrial electronic stuff. Paul, of course, would eventually just get tired of Al's crap, and he would split, and the whole Luxa Pan thing would become a thing of the past. I mentioned it before, but bands generally don't make music like this anymore, and I don't know that industrial noise rock is even a thing now. Maybe some Rammstein sounds like this, and I guess they're pretty popular. I don't know, because I don't really listen to Rammstein. But for the most part, this sort of aggressive electronic music doesn't exist anymore except in the past, and that's another reason I love it. I love it because it's not around anymore. It's sort of like an out-of-print collectible there's only so much of it, and you have to love what's there because you're not going to get any more. So where are they now? Acid Horse, PTP, and 1,000 Homo DJs and Pailhead are clearly done. Supposedly Al and Jello are working on a new Lard album, according to Jello on his podcast. RevCo for a while was leading something of a double life with two completely different bands using the name. You had Al's hand-picked RevCo team, which only rarely featured Al, and those guys have pretty much broken up by now. But then you also had Paul, Luke, Richard, and Chris with some of their friends like Jason Novak and Dan Brill and Jamie Duffy. Basically, the Cox of old minus Al, Bill, and Fildo. And they got together for the first WaxTrax Retrospectacle and toured on and off as the Cox ever since. And I caught them in 2016. They were an absolute blast. Of course, Lead into Gold is more active than ever. I just saw them on a Skinny Puppy tour, and Paul just released a new album earlier this year. Now, there's always been some speculation here in the last year or so that Al and Paul might work together again, given that they apparently are talking again. But by all accounts, that's all they're doing, talking. And maybe that's for the best. I mean, we don't always have to have a band reunion. As the KLF pointed out, comebacks are almost always crap. Maybe it's enough just for people to be friendly again. So there you have it, kids. We would have been happy if Uncle Al and Uncle Paul had just given us ministry, but in fact they gave us so much more. And they're still giving it to us to some extent. We didn't even touch on how many bands were inspired by these guys, or how many other musicians they worked with. I remember Al once had a webpage where he listed all of his collaborators, and it was pretty impressive. We didn't even mention Al starting a label and bringing up some younger bands. We didn't mention all the opening bands that he and Paul gave slots to, and we didn't mention all the bands that they produced in their careers. But those are among the reasons, folks, why those two guys are industrial royalty. Your true value as an artist isn't in the dollars you earn, but in the minds you turn. It's the impact you've had on other people's lives. And they had a good impact on mine, so thanks, guys. This was Stronger Than Reason, episode 23. Check out our other episodes on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And remember to like and sub, kids. It sure doesn't pay the bills. Lord knows I don't get 1 red cent for this, but it does spread the word. Please leave a review or comment if you're so inclined. I do try to reply to everyone, so let's chat. Thanks a lot for listening, and until next time, stay strong.